All right, I hope everybody is doing well today. We are going to be talking about Chapter 2, which is all about virus structure and classification. I'm going to have this lecture split into two parts. And so I've really got three topics to talk about today. So we'll talk about just some of the common characteristics of viruses. We'll talk about the basic structure of viruses. And then at the end, I wanted to briefly discuss virus classification and taxonomy. Okay, so let's talk about some of these properties of viruses. Of course, viruses are small. We discussed that fact in Chapter 1. But what does that really mean? Well, just to give you a sense of scale here you have a human cell. Average human cell would be somewhere between 10 and 30 micrometers in diameter. Um, there would be 1,000 micrometers in 1 millimeter. You may be more familiar with the millimeter scale. Um, and here's a bacterium at the low end of that micrometer scale. And then you can see an assortment of viruses here. They're all on the nanometer scale. So there would be 1,000 nanometers in 1 micrometer. So significantly smaller than even bacteria. Um, and I'd encourage you, go check out University of Utah Department of Genetics has this cool animation that gives you a nice sense of uh, cellular and molecular scale. Basically starts with some everyday items that you can see with the naked eye, and as you move the slider along the bottom, it zooms in and gives you, you know, relative sizes of all kinds of other things that we learn about in biology, including viruses and bacteria. That's kind of fun to play around with. All right, so we know they're small on the nanometer scale. Um, we've already mentioned in Chapter 1 that viruses are obligate intracellular parasites, meaning they have to be inside of a living cell in order to survive. Uh, Virus genomes can be very diverse. They could be DNA, which is not be surprising, but there are a lot of viruses that actually have RNA as their genetic material. And in fact, as we'll see when we talk about classification at the end, viruses tend to be classified based on the nature of their genetic material. Is it DNA? Is it RNA? Is it single-stranded? Is it double-stranded? So you'll see DS versus SS for those designations. Um, and viruses are really unique in that respect. You could have a virus that has a single-stranded RNA genome, which you would never see in the plant or animal kingdom. Um, Genome sizes of viruses can vary quite a bit. So, on average, they're usually going to be somewhere between 7 and 20 kilobases. That would be thousands of nucleotides. So, between 7 and 20,000 nucleotides in length. Um, just to give you numbers on a few different viruses here. So COVID-19 that we're all interested in right now, that is a RNA virus and actually has the largest known RNA virus genome so far at about 30,000 base pairs. Herpes viruses are significantly larger than that, about 200 plus thousand base pairs. Very large virus, Pandora virus genome, about 2.5 million base pairs, but that's quite unusual. Just to give you a sense of comparison, a small eukaryotic genome, for example, red algae, would be 8 million base pairs. The human genome is 3 gigabases or 3 billion bases. And so far, the largest known identified genome is actually, surprisingly, the loblolly pine tree at 22 billion bases. Um, Plants tend to have significantly larger genomes, or they certainly can, because plants can tolerate very high ploidy numbers, large numbers of copies of chromosomes, which then ends up giving them significantly more DNA than you might find in some animal cells. But anyway, obviously our focus here is on viruses, so you're usually talking thousands of base pairs, even for a large virus genome. So let's talk about their physical structure now. Uh, so I think I introduced this idea of a virion in Chapter 1, But a virion is basically that basic structural unit of a virus. And the virion typically consists of the genome, whatever that happens to be, DNA or RNA, single-stranded, double-stranded, surrounded by a capsid protein. So this is typically, one or a small handful of proteins that are just repeated over and over again and sort of surround and protect that genome. And there's a special term for all of this together. We call that the nucleocapsid, or sometimes, as I said, just the virion. But if you see that term nucleocapsid, that's referring to the nucleic acid plus the capsid protein. And in some cases, that is the entire virion for many viruses. Okay, so we've got that. And this structure, as we'll see, can vary quite a bit. The actual shape, I should say, could vary quite a bit. Everything from like the bacteriophage that has the weird sort of like lunar lander type shape to something very simple like this. But we'll look at a few different examples of common virus shapes. There are some viruses that are said to be enveloped compared to the virion we were just talking about that would be considered quote unquote naked. An envelope virus just means it's surrounded by a membrane. That would be the envelope. Similar terminology to like the nuclear envelope, right? Is the membrane around the nucleus of a cell. But the membrane that you find in envelope viruses is usually a membrane taken from the host cell. So as a virus enters and infects a cell, it'll actually cloak itself. Or I should say, as a virus leaves a cell, it'll cloak itself in the host cell membrane so that then as it shows up at another cell, it is basically welcomed in because the new cell sees that membrane and recognizes it as self. So it's basically like a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of phenomenon. Um, Anytime you have an envelope virus, there are going to be proteins called the matrix proteins that are basically facilitating the interaction between the capsid proteins. So we still have that basic, capsid structure here inside the envelope. So they're facilitating the interaction between the capsid proteins and the membrane and the envelope. And then often you're going to find other proteins embedded in and projecting from the envelope. Those would be usually attachment proteins, so they would be important for the virus to attach to a host cell. And even naked viruses will need those attachment proteins as well. So since the naked virus doesn't have the envelope, those attachment proteins will have to be interspersed with the capsid proteins. Okay, so when we think about virus structure, virus shape, the shape of these virions, it's really three common shapes. So helical, icosahedral, or complex, which is essentially just everything that's not helical or icosahedral. So I just wanted to show you some of the basics of these three shapes. Um, Helical, we're all, hopefully as biology majors, you're all familiar with the idea of a helix, right? We learned about DNA being a double helix, but helical is just referring to that sort of twisted structure. And what you see in helical viruses is usually this is referring to the fact that the capsid proteins are organized in a helical array. In this particular example, this would be tobacco mosaic virus. We talked about this, a plant virus, very first virus ever discovered. But you see in this instance, right, the capsid proteins are basically organized in this helical distribution. And this is an RNA virus, tobacco mosaic virus. So you have the viral RNA basically coiled up inside the capsid there, also in a helical shape in this instance. And here's a little nicer 3D representation of what that might look like. So this would be the tobacco mosaic virus is actually in these long rods. So this would be just a little slice of that. But you can see the capsid protein subunits here in different colors just so you can easily distinguish them. And you can clearly see, almost looks like a satellite image of a hurricane with the eye of the storm here in the middle, and that's where the RNA, the genetic material would be coiled up. If you're interested in seeing this in a little bit more detail, I've got a link to a YouTube video here that really looks at nice, very high resolution 3D modeling of tobacco mosaic virus, helical virions, and you can see it rotating around, and it's pretty impressive and uh, cool to look at. So any helical virus, there's basically two key parameters in a helix. There's the amplitude, which is just simply the diameter of the helix if you're looking down on it from above. And then there's the pitch, which would be the height of one particular turn of the helix. And the pitch can pretty easily be determined if you know some of the details about the capsid protein subunits themselves. So just some simple math. If you know basically the height, the rise of each individual capsid protein subunit, and you know how many subunits there are in one turn of the helix, that will give you the pitch. So this would be analogous to trying to measure the height of a staircase, just simply by knowing, okay, each step is 1 foot in height, and I know there's X number of steps. Right? If I do that simple multiplication, that's going to give me the height of the whole staircase. So similar idea here. And just to give you a few examples of common helical viruses, we were already talking about tobacco mosaic virus. Right here, you can see those long rod-shaped virions. Right, so it's basically just one long helix. Here we have vesicular stomatitis virus, which has these unique bullet-shaped capsids, but they're technically helical because the nucleocapsid inside is helical. Ebola, very famous. You see that, everybody knows that's Ebola. Is helical in these threads that can actually be quite long. And more recently, COVID-19, aka SARS-CoV-2 virus, is technically helical. This is an RNA virus that's enveloped, but if we look inside the envelope, here you see the nucleocapsid protein, which is basically just the capsid protein associated with the RNA, is arranged in this helical structure. And we'll talk about this, but COVID is a coronavirus. You're probably aware of that. And that family of viruses, that group of viruses, gets their name from the sort of crown-like appearance that these glycoproteins on the surface of the envelope give to the whole viral particle. All right, so we talked about, any virus could be enveloped or could be naked. That holds true for helical viruses. Most plant viruses are helical. Most of them tend to be naked as well. For example, tobacco mosaic virus. However, all animal viruses that are helical are enveloped, at least all that have been identified to date, including a bunch of common ones like influenza, and some pretty high profile ones like Ebola and COVID, as we just discussed. All right, I'm going to stop there, and in part 2 I will pick up talking about icosahedral viral shape.